Welcome back. My name is Nick Davies and I'm a Programme Director here at the Institute. So far today, the focus has been on central government, but now we are going to look at the state of local government. Pressure on local government finances has never been higher. Spending remains lower in real terms than it was in 2010, but while funding has been cut, demand for acute statutory services, particularly adult and children's social care and homelessness, has continued to grow. As a result, funding for and access to universal council services such as libraries, children's centres and youth clubs has been cut dramatically. In the budget, the government increased core grant funding for local authorities by £1.3 billion for 2025-26, and in combination with expected increases in council tax and business rates, that amounts to a roughly 3.2% real terms increase, which is roughly in line with spending increases over the last 5 years. However, that will still leave core spending power for local authorities almost 10% lower than it was in 2010. And much of that additional funding will be swallowed up by increases in national insurance and the national living wage. That leaves local authorities in a tough spot and central government with some difficult decisions to make ahead of the spending review. The government has already indicated that it will provide councils with multi-year finance settlements from April 26 onwards and reduce the number of small funding pots. And it has set out ambitious plans for the reorganisation of local government in the English Devolution white paper. So how sustainable is local government funding and what does local government need from the spending review? What impact will the reforms contained in the English Devolution white paper have on local government? And how can local government work more effectively with other public bodies to meet citizens' needs? To discuss those questions and more, I'm delighted to be joined by such a fantastic group of speakers. We'll be starting with presentations from Jenny Rowlands, Chief Executive of Camden Council, and Claire Taylor, Chief Operating Officer of Sheffield City Council. I will then put some questions to our three panellists. Jim McMahon, Minister for Local Government and English Devolution, Florence Eshalomi, Chair of the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee, and Hilary Cottam, author of Radical Help and a 10-year experiment that has shown in practice and at scale how the welfare state can be redesigned with local government as a critical partner. I'm going to leave plenty of time for questions from the audience, so if you're watching online, please do start submitting your questions now. Right, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jenny Rowlands.
I'm Jenny Rowlands and I'm the Chief Exec at Camden. Is anyone in the audience from local government? Ah, great. Okay, so we've been given 7 minutes to talk about how you fix local government. So I am going to talk really fast and I'm going to put some slides up that make like slim relationship to what I say, and then I'm inviting you all just to come and talk to us, because I think this is what we're going to say to you is the short answer is that the crisis in front of us and the opportunity to reform means that to fix local government, we need to wake ourselves up, to see the people and the communities in front of us, to work deeply into places, to make use of the assets we have, and to commit each day to work on something that's about purposeful change. And I will talk about how, if you think about it, how that leads into diversity of workforce, psychological safety, having a strengths-based approach, and believing, as I think Jim uses the expression, really putting some skin into the game. I think local government does that every day, but I'm going to talk about how we need to do it more. Okay, so that's not moving. Yeah. Okay. One of the challenges, I think, is how do we talk about a kind of unprecedented poly-crisis in a way, in the introduction you just heard it, in a way that you don't all start to zone out, because we've been talking about it for like 14 years plus. I've been in local government, I always say roughly about 150 years, and I've done some amazing work decades ago with Hilary, for example, and like things still shift didn't shift. So I'm trying to get you to just hear it and wake up to what we're really saying about the lived experience of what we call this kind of perma-crisis or polycrisis. And you'll see from the slides behind me that what I'm trying to say is if you look at all of the money we spend, the crisis money we spend, we are hosing money on ridiculous solutions instead of being able to look at what we can really do, look at the person in front of us and get permanent, sustainable solutions. These are just a few examples. One of the things that I know, but in London we've got 56% of the temporary accommodation crisis is in London at the moment. In Camden, there isn't one affordable home in Camden. So we cannot house. We're housing in bed and breakfast, really for the first time in a long time. At the moment, I think we're around 8 or 9 million overspent. In Camden, we've set up the early help teams that we had to settle refugees are now helping our children in bed and breakfast, because that is the level of need that adults and children need when you're moving people around every few days. And I just want that to settle. That's what we are doing to families at the moment in London. And as you know, 1 in 21 children in London at the moment are homeless. So that's at least one child in every classroom. And Camden is a council that runs well, isn't at the crisis end of spend, but still cannot meet that need. So we talk about how, if you like, the reality, I'm going to talk about how the reality of what we need is resources, capabilities and motivation. So without reforming how we spend, we'll simply continue to have the crisis of spend. And I want to say that councils are the government's best and most willing partner. From all of the things we did around test and vaccines during pandemics, to providing and enabling local employment and business startups of all shapes and sizes. We can respond, and this idea of us being a safety net, as I go through the presentation, you see, it's extraordinary when you stop and think about what we do in councils now that we never did before with so much less money. And I want to say something about being lucky in Camden, that I've worked with bold politicians that have taken particular decisions over the last decade and have invested in assets in a different way. And so for us in Children's Services, some of you might have read about that story of our success. But in Camden, we spend about a third of our Children's Services budget on prevention. That's unusual. And to do that, a couple of things have happened. First of all, we don't overspend the extent that you hear in other local authorities. We keep children out of care. We hold risk in a different place. But the bit that I think is amazing is that because we are asset-based or strength-based and work with the families, even when we've had to intervene and take children out of their parents' home, we then work with the mother, and now more and more with fathers. The mother comes, works with us, then we co-produce training. We have mothers come back whose children have gone into care, and they come back and help us work with the next generation of parents. We have fathers who lead fathers groups. So one of the big things that I need to get across very quickly is people need to stop thinking, I don't like the term empowering very much, or, we're not bestowing. The answer is in front of you. It is about looking at the person, trusting, believing, and having that relationship. And that's what will make lasting changes. And when I talk, because I wear a flowery dress, and because I talk in an enthusiastic way, some people think this is very fluffy. But by doing this work, we estimate we save around £19 million a year on our children's budget. So I always say to people, look at our data as well as our joyous faces when we talk about loving and caring and working. This makes sense. And we've been stopped, and what we talk about a lot is just unblocking what's been in the way for decades. And social workers come into their work for social justice. If you take away all the stuff that stops them from being human with the person in front of them, amazing things happen. Another example of what I think we've done when we've been allowed to, and now we're working with the government where the door's open. this is what I call the hosing money section, is like in 2021 in Camden, about 1,800 Afghan refugees arrived with I think maybe 3 days warning into 2 or 3 hotels. And we stood up a lot of care in the normal way around people while we waited, and we started working with the Home Office to look at longer-term solutions. Across London, everyone did the normal thing that we tried to do. We tried to do the fair share work. I think we said we'd make maybe 9 or 10 permanent homes available. No one would tell us how much we were spending. We weren't able to find out how much was being spent in the hotels, but the Home Office was very willing to work with us. We did an Afghan coalition with our VCS, our business partners. If you get someone other than local government to talk, people are less defensive. So we all went and said, we've got a great idea. We build homes in Camden. We build homes for full sale, to cross-subsidise real social housing. And we proved that if you just gave us the money for those homes, which were never going to be for your settled community, so don't cause any problems in your community. Actually, it's an asset that stays with you. And if you work with your community and explain what you're doing, we, instead of housing 9 or 10, we housed over 120 Afghan, Ukrainian, and Syrian refugees, and we're still talking about housing more people in our community. I was going to use this as an example today of how the Home Office could change and work with us on this, but actually there's a pilot meeting this morning that Camden's been invited to, and those same civil servants, I think, that were with us before, have set up a whole pilot. I can't talk about some of it, it's embargoed, but when you hear about it, it's that model, it's that trust model about where you put the money for sustained change. So things are moving. I don't know why this... lovely. Okay, so the next thing is around capabilities. And I think we see the need to evidence to government that local government finance needs to be organised around outcomes, but also to look at the full sort of state capacity. We need to focus on our capabilities to ensure that we don't do a kind of sweeping, heavy-handed, painful reforms of the past. In fact, reform might look like prioritising investment in council skills and capabilities that's enabling to the kind of preventative shift that I've just talked about. And we've seen in government the recently discussed test and learn approach, and we've done that in Camden for a long time. Again, I think people do shortcut and think that's piloting. It is a whole different set of capabilities. And I know the Minister knows that we're going to do rapid learning. I chair a self-improvement board across London. I know that people will need to learn very different approaches very quickly, and we don't all have the skills. But although Pat McFadden attributed test and learn to, I think it was to our tech bros, I think it belongs much more in local government. I think we've done it for a long time with our communities and our partnerships. And I think that's a set of skills where you have to understand your data, insight and evidence, but also understand the power of storytelling and lived experience. Having bravery, having confidence, and having the ability to hold risk at the right level is how you'll get that early stuff. I always say to our leaders that we need to say, I'm sorry, I was wrong, I need help, I need to do it differently. And if you think about your workplace, how often you've heard that said, I do think it is a shift, that you're not rewarded for saying things like that, and you will need to do it in test and learn.
Jenny, I'm just conscious of time.
How long have I got?
We'll be going just over 10 minutes.
Right, my final point is around motivation, because for you to do all of this, leaders need to give psychological safety to their workforce. And again, it's something we could talk about a lot. But if you want people to hold risk in a different way, then as leaders, you need to be able to say to people that they won't, the kind of the myth of accountability, people will retreat into very bureaucratic ways if they think that they're overwhelmed by resource. And you need to step out as leaders and let people know you've got their back. Come and see us, and I enjoy talking to you.
Thank you. Next up, Claire Taylor.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Right, I haven't got any slides because I attract IT gremlins. So it's a real privilege to be here today representing Sheffield and talking to you all about local government. And I don't really want to start by causing too much trouble, but I'm going to gently challenge the exam question. So the question was how to fix local government. And I would say to you, I'm not sure local government needs fixing, because if we wanted to design joined-up services, if we wanted to focus on service delivery, if we wanted to put people at the heart of what we do, we'd pretty much design local government. So, and I'd want to honour and respect the kind of exceptional municipal heritage of our cities and towns. They've got a long, amazing track record of delivery, and I think we should remember that. And the reason that's really important is because of some of the things that Jenny said that I'm going to talk a little bit about as well. So the role of the devolution work, strategic authorities, it represents an opportunity and I hope a confidence in local government and local public service delivery as a partner and not as a unit of service delivery, as we've sometimes been seen. But right now, local government isn't meeting citizens' expectations. That's evident. And it will be my contention that it's not the institutions necessarily. It's the conditions those institutions are operating in that are really in need of the fix. So I'm dwelling on that difference because, as I said, if we are going to challenge the workforce crisis, if we're going to recruit amazing people to do detailed, strengths-based work with some really vulnerable people in our communities, they have to believe in it. They have to want to do it. And that's so important. So if we don't learn the lessons from austerity, if we don't learn the lessons from a fractured workforce, what we don't want to do is repeat those mistakes as we move into regional and strategic authorities. This is too good an opportunity for us to lose. So if local government isn't broken, sorry guys, why does it need fixing? And I've got 4 things that I really wanted to pick up on in relation to that. So we've talked about funding, right? Funding is an issue. Sheffield City Council has seen a 20.2% reduction in its real terms funding since 2010. And we all know about funding, don't we? We all know that annual based causes a whole load of perverse incentives. We're competing with one another for small pots. We can't do preventative and upstream work as effectively. But it does something else as well. It really stifles people's morale. It stifles a sense of innovation, entrepreneurship at the local level. And from a workforce perspective, what we need to remember is that for the last 15 years, our management and leadership communities, our voluntary sector communities who work with us, have all been operating in that way. And we're going to have to unlearn that culture, and that's really important. So my second point is around performance. I can list some of the issues. These directly relate to our in-year overspends. They relate to our funding pressures, homelessness, temporary accommodation, the customer experience of the services we deliver not keeping pace with the rest of the world, special educational needs provision, the pressure on adult services, the lack of investment in infrastructure. Too many people feel let down by the services we provide. And that's a really important thing to recognise, because luckily we're also looking at redesigning our performance and our standards and our accountabilities framework. But what we need to do is make sure that our aspirations around people-based services, about learning from people, about really understanding the experience of the residents we serve, is reflected in the authorising environment, the audit environment, the regulatory environment, the things that make us work together. So that dual opportunity to design that system is so important. Third point, workforce. So we hear about this in the NHS, and I'm sure you're all really familiar with the argument and the discussion around skills, around recruitment, around the crisis of morale, around the psychological contract between the employer and the employee. It is no different in local government. We have an ageing workforce. We have high levels of sickness, low levels of skills. Really great examples, things like digital skills, data skills, really, really important. So if people aren't at the heart of this period of renaissance and transformation in local delivery, this renaissance will be hollow. So I'm very clearly reflecting some of Jenny's points, but I think it's really important. And one of the things that resonated with me is that sense of investment might be in people, not systems and structures. So the last of my fixing points is trust. So trust is a national issue and we all face it every day, but it has a very, very real local dimension. So I can list some things to get you thinking about questions for us. Section 114, failures, local government bankruptcy, commissioners, service delivery failures, failure of governance, child sexual exploitation, damp and mould, send applications, low traffic neighbourhoods without a lot of community engagement, street tree inquiries. So the consequence of this failure is eroding trust in our local democracy as well. And the community tensions that we experienced last summer become inevitable within this context. So the Sheffield response to that, so I'm going to try and keep this really brief for you. The Sheffield response to that is one of optimism, right? We have to be optimistic. We've got a duty for the people that we work with to be optimistic about the role, purpose and inspiration that local government gives. As a city council and as a place leader, we rose to the challenge during lockdown like everyone across the public sector did. And after lockdown, we set on a journey to kind of reimagine what the City Council could be. So we started, and some of that related to some governance challenges we had with regards to our own street tree inquiry, which you can Google at your own leisure. We began this with a really amazing system-wide partnership conversation and some deep public engagement to identify what we've called city goals. And these goals form the basis of 6 Sheffield stories. And these are the stories that we want to tell of our successes to come. So these stories are Sheffield's mission. And then what we've done is set about thinking about these missions, these city goals, these public stories of Sheffield, and reimagining how we as a council plan to deliver against those. So in 4s, again, what have we learnt from this approach to kind of mission-led transformation? 1, it's about people and relationships. That's about humility through listening and working with people and then acting upon it. And our political leaders are absolutely central to this. I'd hate for the role of our elected politicians to get lost in this conversation. And it's about strengths-based, it's about stop admiring the problem and looking at the funding challenges and acting on that. And actually we know what some of the examples of great practice are on a local level. We're already testing and learning on them. That vision, mission, ambition and optimism, we employ over 8,000 people in Sheffield. We spend millions with commissioning, and so we impact on the working lives of many, many people, as well as in terms of service delivery. If we want to make these system changes, if we want to create environments where it is safe to learn, if we want to do things differently, we have to take people with us on that journey. And that means we also have to be outcomes focused. So one of our commitments is a culture of performance and delivery, but balancing that focus on 40-minute waiting times in a customer contact centre or the time it takes to turn around an empty property with large-scale upstream systems change means that the way we design our regulatory and our assurance systems is absolutely important. And so lastly, the last point I will keep saying I'm going to be quick, is we've got a one council transformation. To achieve all of this, we have 6 themes of change, and I'm going to list them and then I'm going to zip it. So those 6 themes of change are around working with and with our communities and empowering our communities, and that is a little bit contested, but it is about handing power over. It's about genuine, deep partnership. It's about user experience design, data-led customer journeys that make a real difference to people's experience of what we do. Single front doors. We have to redesign our services within the context of massive system change. So all of our partners are also going through change as well. So we have to be really clear about what works for people and then design around that. And we have to reduce some of the failure demand costs because there is duplication and inconsistency in our systems. We have to do commissioning, procurement and market management much better because we spend a lot of money and we need to get the best possible value for public buck on that. And then we need to think about mission control and enabling services. So you imagine an enabling service, whether it's HR or fleet, they've all been hollowed out in local government. And we need to put some of that thinking back so we actually have the capacity to fix ourselves and not rely on lots of third-party support for that.
Thank you. I'm going to have to bring it to an end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
OK, I'm just going to ask a few questions for our panellists before opening it up to the audience. I'm going to move beyond it, but I think we probably have to start a little bit with funding, something both Jenny and Claire mentioned. And I particularly wanted to pick up on Jenny's point on prevention, because I know that's a big objective for the government as well. And the local government finance statement said prevention is critical if we're going to turn around the cycle of system failure and cost escalation. I think many people in this room will agree with that sentiment. Jim, I wanted to ask whether you think councils have sufficient headroom to make that shift towards prevention when funding is so tight and demand for acute services is so high?
Well, it's a good challenge in terms of the scale which you can move the dial from the kind of reactive, very expensive approach that local government are currently faced with and the more efficient, preventative, better outcome model that we want to move to. I think the truth is that many councils do it anyway, that they recognise at a local level the best way to align good public services are around the people and the place, and that by doing that they achieve more efficient public services and also more fundamentally just better outcomes for local people and local economies. However, they will also say that they are held back by other parts of the system. And so when we talk about public sector reform and we talk about prevention, we're not just talking about councils doing things differently. We're talking about reimagining the state at a place-based level. And that's about acknowledging the role of local government as leaders of place, not just leaders of an organisation. And I think sometimes in parts of government that can be lost. But it's also recognising that we have to double run systems. We've got to have the current system in place to make sure that I'm not quite sure we're keeping up with demand, but we just about keep our head above water. And very much the £5 billion of new investment into local government this year was our recovery operation. And that's about getting money to the front line where it's needed to support more councils to continue to the next round of the multi-year settlement, where we really begin to kind of rebuild the foundational settlement for councils. So we believe if we can better align people, place and public services together, giving local government the role as leaders of place and the authority and the command of other public services in their area, we will begin to make a difference. And the thing that then we need to marshal is that doesn't work if we're still holding local government to account across thousands of different outputs instead of the outcomes in their area. And so when we move to the multi-year settlement and that new framework, we've got to move away from the micromanagement of local government and far more about the outcomes for the people in the place that they represent and they're working towards. And for the government, that means aligning it to the missions and the plan for change. So there's quite a lot of work in there, but we do recognise that there is not a button to press that fixes this overnight. It's going to take time to rebuild, but we do believe that we've placed the foundations to begin that.
On that question of giving local authorities more flexibility, some have asked for a kind of easing of statutory duties so that they can have greater control over their budgets. Do you think there's a case for that?
I certainly think there's a case for simplifying the funding regime. I think the number of ring-fence pots with quite arbitrary rules around them don't help the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. I don't think the cost of reporting and the industry that's created around it delivers better outcomes. I think a lot of local government, though, is asking for certainty. And so it's as important that we provide the kind of foundational funding, but also the certainty. So this will be the first multi-year settlement next year in a decade. This will be the first time that council will be able to plan ahead over the next 3 years or more across a range of different public services. And that's part of that. But I'll be honest and say that the current system is not sustainable. One, in terms of the way that we marshal at the back end of a problem, not getting ahead of it in terms of prevention, but also that we still have, in large parts, the two-tier system where our ability to move money around the system is hugely restricted and we're not getting the money to the front line where it's needed. So we don't hold back on our ambition for reorganisation. Equally, we're not holding back on our ambition for devolution. If you want to break the centralising model that we have in the UK and in particular in England, you've got to have full coverage of devolution in England, because for every gap in the map, you will always need a central government department to administer the gap in the map. And so if you want to break away the culture of centralisation that we have in the country, you've got to have that full coverage of devolution, but it's got to be on strong foundations, and finance and reorganisation are part of it.
Florence, I know your committee has just launched an inquiry into local government finance. What was your take on the generosity of the funding provided in the budget?
I'm not sure if local authorities will say it was generous. I think the message loud and clear, speaking to colleagues across the local government and with the LGA, is that they have welcomed some of the initial discussions. I think the other thing that's coming back loud and clear is the openness of meetings with ministers and the departments. They very much welcome that collaborative approach, as opposed to, if we're honest, some of the issues around local government being blamed for issues. So I think, you know, that's something that they've been quite receptive to. And it's a no-brainer that our first major inquiry as a select committee is looking at the funding and sustainability of local government finance, because you have a situation where, if you look at the last few years, since 2018, 7 local authorities, Claire mentioned it, have come forward to issue Section 114 notices. They've gone bankrupt. We have a situation where a number of local authorities, the in-year pressures that they are facing, you know, the additional funding from government, very much welcome, but that will be absorbed in a matter of weeks because of those pressures that they are facing. We have a situation where London boroughs collectively are spending £4 million a day, £114 million a month, over £1.9 billion a year, just on temporary accommodation. We haven't spoken about their statutory duty in terms of children's social care, adult social care. This is just temporary accommodation. So the funding situation is not sustainable. And I think, going back to what you asked, Jim, just there in terms of issues around what are statutory services versus non-statutory, is the system that local government currently have, is it fit for purpose? What are the pressures that local government are facing? How much control and levers do local government have to change some of those? I think Jim's mentioned some of the stuff around some of the ring fencing, which, again, if we're honest, in some cases it helps local authorities, but actually in other areas it's a hindrance. And, you know, the restrictions around that. So as a committee, we want to dive deep into this. It's not just about saying local authorities need more money. It's about where the money's going, what the money's for, and even the system of local authorities auditing themselves. So many local authorities are 3, 4, 5 years out in terms of their local accountant, but yet we're saying give them more money. They need to account for the money that they've been handed in the first place. So that issue around transparency, value for money, really, really key areas. So I think there's still time. If any of you from local government haven't submitted, even if you're not local government, haven't submitted evidence to our committee, that closes on the 27th. We have our first evidence session on the 11th of February, and it's really, really keen. We're keen to engage with so many people from across this, because we can't keep coming back to this saying there's a crisis within local government finance if we're not prepared to do things differently. We have to do things differently, and it has to be about thinking about the people on the receiving end of local government funding.
The funding from April 26 onwards, the spending envelope is quite a bit tighter, and if you take account of spending on NHS, defence and things like that, it implies kind of real terms cuts to unprotected areas of spending like local government. Do you think the government will need to revisit that in the spending review?
I think one of the first things local government is saying that they want the government to revisit is definitely some of the stuff around the ring fencing. Local government want to play their role in some of the government's ambition on building new homes, for example, but yet we have an issue where the figures for the affordable homes programme hasn't been outlined yet. So again, local government and RSLs are in the dark in terms of how much they can contribute. Big issues around Section 106, community infrastructure level, big issues around planning. So I think there are areas where local government would want to sit down and discuss. So again, it's not just about that increase, which local government will gladly take, but actually some of the levers and flexibility that local government have been crying for years. If we are really honest about that devolution, we have to ensure that local leaders who know their areas are able to do that placemaking locally. And that will only happen if they have more financial freedom from the money coming in.
Hilary, we've heard quite a lot about kind of different ways of spending local pots of money more effectively. I wondered if you've seen any kind of particularly good examples at a local level of kind of local authorities working with others to pool budgets, whether that's kind of total place at the end of the last Labour government or more recent schemes, and what you think central government can do or indeed not do to enable more of that type of thing to happen?
I think it's a really good question. I think that, when I was invited, I thought, the panel should have been, how can we learn from local government? And if I contrast this moment now in this election with 1997, it's definitely the case that in 1997, all the energy was at the centre, the innovation was at the centre, the talent was at the centre, and that is no longer the case. All those energies and powers and ideas are now in local government. Now, it's not evenly distributed. We could talk about brilliant local government, we could talk about less good local government. But I think, for instance, if we talk about, there was a big conversation earlier this morning in one of the panels about trust. Well, in my work, I find that people say about politicians they're all the same, but they don't think that about their local politicians or their local government leaders, especially if they come from those places and have been long rooted in those places. And obviously somebody like Jim is both those people kind of wrapped into one. But so I think that that's also really important. But yes, I think because of the famine that we've seen over the last kind of decade or more, we've seen really radical innovation. And I mean, one example would be, on Jim's patch, which would be Wigan. Again, somebody talked earlier about what about a mission where you could extend healthy life expectancy for 2 years. Well, in Wigan, the leader and the chief executive, Donna Hall, were able to take out, significant amounts of their budget and extend healthy life expectancy in quite deprived places by 10 years. And that was done through really brilliant storytelling. It was the idea of the deal. It was about a new relationship between citizens and local government that enabled kind of really big savings, sort of really dramatic outcomes in terms of housing, children's services, and healthy life expectancy. And I think that that's also something that's sort of perhaps a bit invisible in the conversations and in kind of devolution papers and so on, is that our sort of solving these problems is not about vertical relationships. It's about very, very strong horizontal relationships, whether that is between government departments, which we've been talking about today, between kind of, sort of health and whatever, Sheffield, great teaching hospitals, fantastic relationships with the local authority, lots of things going on as anchor institutions, which is just really, really brilliant. But also about people and community organisations. So I think that, places where I work, for instance, like Barrow, which have got, really, really fantastic solutions to the care problem, are places where those horizontal connections are really, really strong between local government and the community. And that's what's really important and I think missing a bit at the moment in the piece. And then, also just to go back to kind of the care example, it seems to me impossible for local government to thrive unless we can do something about social care. If 86% of your budget is going on 3% of your population, let's say in Bradford, that's the figure, then you've really got a democratic deficit. You are spending on such a tiny percentage of your population when you need parks, libraries, and all the rest of it. So that would be the question I'd be asking is, how can that be devolved? We've got brilliant care practice in local government, and yet are we really going to wait for 3 years in order to kind of do something that is absorbing all the resource and is ultimately, back to Camden, you've got brilliant work on the foundational economy. It's not just kind of economic growth and incomes, it's about all public services. And, again, back to a panel this morning, how are we going to rate the Labour government? People are going to rate whether their lives have changed, and that is partly the growth story, but it's a lot about care and services. And unless we kind of free up and think about this really differently, which is a relationship between local government and communities in those places, we're not going to get there.
I want to pick up on the question of leadership. It's something that you mentioned.
Yes.
I think most of our speakers have mentioned leadership, and wherever we find an example of a public service working well, the common factor tends to be high quality leadership. But it seems quite difficult to kind of replicate that or grow it. What do you think central government can do to develop, recruit, retain and keep motivated more high quality leaders in local government? What are the barriers to...
Well, I think a very important thing is what my fellow panellists have talked about kind of multi-year settlements, because one of the things I talk about in Radical Help is that if somebody changes in the Formula One team, it's on the front page of the Times. We expect to solve the problems of adult social care in this country with leaders that might change every 6 months. But this is a kind of, you've got to have that position, you've got to hold it, as all our best leaders, have done. They've been in positions for a decade or more, holding that position, and then you're in a position to kind of make that change. But given the enormous psychic pressures that local government leaders are under at the moment, there is this massive churn. And so, and that is kind of related to funding and kind of lack of headroom and just complete stress. People are like, well, maybe the local authority around the corner, I might do a better job. But we've really, really got to invest in leaders and see that kind of time and position is what's required to kind of make the changes we need to see.
Jim, I want to ask one more question of you before opening it up to the audience. As Hilary just said, there is a kind of variance in performance in different local authorities, which is to be expected. And I think you might expect if local authorities have more autonomy, that there might be even more variance in performance. And I wondered what your view is on kind of how hands-on or hands-off central government should be in cases of poor performance. How can you hold the poor performers to account while giving the best performers more autonomy to innovate?
Well, I think if you believe in a devolved system and you believe in localism, then the people who ought to hold councils to account are the electorate. They ought to be able to make a value choice, judgment about whether the council is delivering for the council tax that people are paying or not. And I think often what's lost in the conversations about council pressures, because of course the dominating pressures on children's services, adult social care and homelessness are so dominating, is actually just a complete demolition of neighbourhood services. Most people don't receive adult social care and most children are not in children's social care. Most people aren't homeless. The amount of money that is being spent in the round for a very small pool of the local population isn't being experienced by the majority of the population that is questioning why on earth am I paying more and more council tax for less and less in terms of how my place feels. And actually the biggest challenge for me, if I'm honest, is how do we get to the end of this parliament, the end of the multi-year settlement, the kind of advance on the devolution journey and we're kind of repairing the foundations, and for people to feel as though the places where they live are just better. That they're clean, they're well cared for, people are optimistic about the future, and that might be their immediate neighbourhood, it could be their high street. High streets are hugely symbolic about people's optimism or cynicism about the direction of the place where they live. So I think that's important, and I think it's unfair not to reflect that councils have been left to fight that fight by themselves for far too long. And so my responsibility in that is to make sure that in whatever context there is, the councils are not just fairly funded, that means different things to different people, I can tell you that, but actually the money goes to where it is needed. And government need to be far more honest about what central government's role is in redistribution of the resource that is available. And you're right, in the round, there are clearly pressures on the quantum. But that's not to say we can't do more to get the money to where it's needed, which is why this year, for the first time in over a decade, we have a deprivation and a needs-based funding formula through the recovery grant, where we are taking into account the ability of local areas to raise their local tax, but also recognising that deprivation is a significant contributor to demand in many areas that wasn't previously taken into account in the way that it was needed. So we are beginning to do that kind of foundational work, but there are structural reforms needed. It is not acceptable from a taxpayer's point of view to have nearly £100 billion of public money that hasn't been audited and accounted for. And it's not acceptable at all that central government cannot confirm its whole of government accounts because of local government. So we have to get our house in order, we have to get the basics right, but we can't return to what was the Audit Commission. I think many of us have long memories of the Audit Commission, and we don't want to return to that overbearing, dominant inspection regime, but we do need to introduce measures, and we kind of go for it in the white paper, about measures like the local audit office, where we repair the foundations of local audit to make sure that the provision is there, that there's a good working relationships between auditors and their council, but also where we have the early warning system built back up centrally so that we can pick up any systemic faults in the system early enough before we end up with a rat of 114s and councils going both left, right and centre. So we are beginning that structural work, but in the end, we've got to put local government back on its feet so when it faces the electorate can hold it to account for the local decisions that it is making.
Thank you. I'm going to open up to some questions from the audience, so please do put your hand up. I'm going to take a few together. Can you please say your name, where you're from, and can you please keep them very short and ensure they are in fact questions and not long meandering statements. I'm going to take the 3 hands that are up on this side.
Hi, I'm Martin George from the Local Government Chronicle. A question for the Minister. The Devolution White Paper said we'll expect all 2-tier areas to develop proposals for reorganisation. Yesterday you told MPs the government are not requiring any area to reorganise. Are you backtracking on the need for reorganisation? And if so, is it because of the level of local opposition?
Thank you. And there were 2 more. I think this lady here.
Thank you. Hamida Ali from the Future Governance Forum. Jim, you've talked with council leaders about the need to reset the relationship between government and local government, and Jenny and Claire both talked about local government being the best and willing partner. So what does it look like for you in a sort of mission-driven context if government is genuinely partnering with local government rather than being seen as a unit of service delivery as it was described?
Thank you. And one more.
Hello, I'm Ed Hammond from the Centre for Governance and Scrutiny. Just wanted to ask, sort of picking up on Hilary, what you said about the sort of relational role of local government. What lessons you and the rest of the panel think that the British state overall can learn from local government's experience in developing those more relational ways of working, connection to local communities, the sort of mission governance you talked about, that connection that perhaps we talked this morning about missing?
Thank you. Really 3 great questions. One on what can central government learn about how to take a more relational approach from central government. Are 2-tier areas required to reorganise? And what would a kind of genuine partnership between central and local government look like? Jim, I'm going to come to you first.
Yeah, so there are 2 aspects. One is the foundational work being laid for the English Devolution Bill. Obviously, we published the white paper before Christmas, and that sets out the ambition. There is a requirement that we basically bring to an end the 2-tier system, and councils will be required to reorganise. My comment in Parliament was about the Devolution Priority Programme, which is this current round where councils have been invited to self-select to be part of the priority programme, where they'll get a twin track of devolution and reorganisation together. And we've been really impressed, by the way, by the local leadership being shown by councils who recognise both the need to reorganise and reform, but also that devolution can unlock the potential. And I'm very clear in my own mind that when we talk about growth, we can only achieve that with reform together. They are 2 sides of the same coin. And so how we align the growth agenda through our strategic authorities and mayors taking the leadership of that wider geography and that wider economy in place will work, as well as the local council reorganising public services at a local level, so we're focused on community people in the places where they live and on the prevention agenda. So they're all compatible. But in the end, I'll be clear, and I've been as clear as I can be about the 2-tier system. There is a 2-tier premium that taxpayers are paying for the 2-tier system to exist. And I would say, when asked the question, most people would prefer that money spent on local frontline services being rebuilt and not on organisations to exist. That's not to decry the work of district councils at all. I'm a cheerleader for all of local government, and they've done outstanding things. And during COVID, examples have been given. In many places, it was the district councils doing that work. And so the workers will still be the workers, the public will still be the public, and there will still be a council in place to make sure that that bridge is there. But we do have a responsibility to make sure that that money goes to the front line. And to directly target have we been met with opposition, I would say no. We've been met, one, with realism, that the time has come for this reorganisation, but also, and I say this absolutely genuinely, with an enthusiasm from local government to get going quickly.
Thank you. Florence?
Just on that, I think it's, with my chair hat on, it's about how we reset that relationship between local government and central government. I think some of the examples we've seen over the last few years has almost been sort of a constant battle and power struggle, and almost essentially sort of a blame game towards local leaders who are having to deal with increasing, population demand and demand for services, but yet decreased budgets and, in effect, real-term funding cuts. So it's how we recognise the work that local government have been doing on a reduced budget, continuing to do and play their role, and, you know, the government recognising that. And I think it's time for us to look at how we restore some of those relationships, conversations. And like I said, the feedback we've been hearing is that local government are quite receptive to some of the early discussions. I know that Jim and his colleagues have been meeting regularly with local government leaders, you know, just having an open and honest dialogue and, you know, being very clear where there are issues, how they can work it through together, as opposed to some of those issues ending up on the front page of certain newspapers. You know, it has to be about a grown-up relationship, especially if we are really honest about the fact that all the issues that local government are outlining won't be resolved overnight. Yes, there are additional funding pressures, but how do we get to a situation where, you know, the central government trusts local government? I think there's the issue of trust as well, which comes up. You know, recognising that, you know, the people and communities are assets as well that local government have at their disposals. And I think finally it's how, you know, some of the suggestions that local government come up with, are they being reflected and are they being welcomed by central government? It doesn't always have to be bottom up. The suggestions can come from the ground, and making sure some of those pilots, I think back to some of the stuff that's happened under the last Labour government, you know, some of those initiatives, you know, really making sure we grasp some of that, because I think it's not just about additional funding, it's about doing things differently. And I hope that with our inquiry, we'll be able to tease some of that out over the next few weeks.
Thank you. Hilary.
Well, I think only the third question was for me. The other two were really for the Minister. But thank you for asking the question about relationships. I mean, I've written a book about relational welfare, Radical Help. It's all in there. But it is a story of 10 years of experimentation at scale with approaches to welfare which have got relationships at their heart, they have better outcomes, they cost a lot less money. I think the problem is that relationships require proximity. If you want to do something different with your children or with your older population, that support can only come by people who live in your local area. So this is something that really kind of sits very well with local government. It looks very different in operation. And then I think when you've got central government asking questions about, you know, sort of the more audit questions, it becomes quite complicated because you can't necessarily tell from the centre what's going on and kind of is money being well spent, because it just looks so different. But it's very hard for me to imagine how we could get out of the challenge that we're in without a kind of relational approach, because we just don't have the budgets to fix health or care or any of these issues in a 1950s model. So we have to have a very human-centred 21st century devolved model, and that is about relationships and it is about local government, and then it's about trust from the centre.
One final question, because I think it relates to both the relational point and your comments on kind of unitary authorities, and a question from Tom Brake. Is there any guarantee that unitary authorities of roughly 500,000 residents will deliver more efficient services, and can they engage residents more effectively in local decision-making than the councils they will replace?
Well, I mean, this is a very live issue. You know, I work in Westmoreland and Furness. It's kind of very long and narrow. It's very difficult to get up and down. So I think this is a difficult question. But, of course, I wouldn't like this to be phrased as efficiency. I would like this to be phrased as flourishing, and what happens in your region and how do you flourish. And then you do need smaller centres. But I think there is something else that's happening, which is that it is inevitable in these places that just as kind of communities have come together and have got very strong ways of providing, let's say, care, suddenly local leadership has got to take its eye off the ball all over again to kind of reorganise. And that is a problem, I think. I think it's probably unavoidable, but it's definitely a problem.
Jim, can I get your thoughts on that quickly?
So, I mean, we set out in the white paper that our working assumption is on reorganisation, new unitary councils of around 500,000 population will be the outcome. But we also recognise that when placed together with devolution, that there is some flex required. And part of that is covering a bigger geography with a mayor and a strategic authority might require a more localised, maybe less than 500,000. However, I think I wouldn't want this just to be a focus on those areas that are going through reorganisation. This should be, and when it works well, it works extremely well. Every council should have a neighbourhood and localism strategy that makes sure that local public services are marshalled around the people in the places where they live. And for most people, that is their immediate neighbourhood or district. It's not the council boundary in the round. And you can see some very large councils, actually, both in terms of geographical coverage and population size, where they get the neighbourhood localism agenda absolutely. and they make sure that this delegation, that councillors are empowered, that we're not relegating people out on the cabinet to be a backbencher rather than a frontline councillor as a community convener, bringing in those local community organisations and charities and local people to co-design is very much where we want to be getting to. So we see this far more as an ambition to kind of grow together rather than a kind of a reorganisation for the sake of reorganisation. It's about putting that kind of sustainable thing on the footing. And I just wanted to address the kind of the cultural point, if I can do, which is I think there are two things that drive culture, many things that drive culture, but two main ones. One is money. I think money in the system drives behaviour very, very strongly. And actually just taking away the ring fencing, having the multi-year settlements, allowing freedoms and flexibilities, stopping the bidding competitions that take place will begin to change some of that parent-child relationship that I think was quite toxic in the previous government. I think that's part of it. But then it's also where power sits. And because we are quite a centralised country, most power is delegated via the Executive and Secretary of State to any other part of government. The problem with that is if you're local government, almost everything you want to do is delegated either via the Secretary of State or with the permission of the Secretary of State. And that can be anything from a business improvement district, it can be a private landlord accreditation scheme, it could even be whether a cattle grid gets installed on a highway. Some of them are so ridiculous, but that's maintaining the centralised power grab in the way that we run the country that's got to be broken up. So the white paper, it talks about structural stuff, but it's very, very strong on the drivers of culture and behaviour that we're trying to change as well.
Thank you. Some of our panellists now have to run, so I'm going to have to bring the event to a close there. We now have a 15-minute break before our next panel, which is on what's next for England's mayors, which will start at 4:15. Until then, please do join me in thanking our three fantastic panellists and our two fantastic speakers.